I'm delighted to be here, and I welcome you all and thank Chris again for this wonderful occasion. I know already from the list of participants and our dinner last night that this is going to be, I think, a wonderful discussion. Okay, Alan and I and Chris, in collaboration with Chris, we were worried about giving full hour-long addresses with given the schedule. So what we will try our best to do, is abbreviate our talks and try to get everything done in about 40 minutes. Now, my paper and Alan's are both on the web, the full versions, and they're downloadable. Don't expect everyone to have read them. But what we'll both, I think, be trying to do is raise provocative questions for discussion throughout the conference. Now, my purpose today, so let me just launch into this to try to get through it as fast as possible. Oh, you're not supposed to see the conclusion before the talk. I don't know how that is to people. Do we need any lights dimmed? Is it okay? Okay, now I usually move around, but I don't have a portable mic. So wave to me in the back if I start absent-mindedly to move and you can't hear me. My voice usually projects pretty well. Okay. It's a little bigger than I'm used to for the portable ones, but okay. So what I'm going to do this morning, the title of this talk, last week I gave a version of this in California, a longer version, and I entitled, the subtitle then was The Possibility Proof of Respectful Dialogue Between Spirituality and Science. And I really do want, I hope, not by myself, but by the conversations that people like, actually Alan Wallace and I, Jinpa, and many other people in this audience have been lucky enough to be part of for the last N number of years, where N is different, 12 to 6 in my case, with His Holiness about science and Buddhism, because they have been, and I'll just say this, extraordinary examples about how when people of goodwill with respectful sensibilities get together, they can disagree and profitably be engaged to examine their own thoughts, traditions, and so on in ways that are just very enriching, and you can leave at the end of the day after a disagreement still loving your interlocutor and going out for a yogurt drink as we do. There are some exceptions to that. Okay, so I launch. Okay, so this, I'm going to focus on the Dalai Lama's most recent book, The Universe in a Single Atom, which is, there have been many comments of his, writings of his, reports about His Holiness's dialogue with science. This is really the first piece in which he's brought together his thoughts about the last 20 years of conversations that he's been having. And I will focus on several things this morning. Now, I always do this. I found this useful. My superscripting technique here, Buddhism is not a monolithic entity any more than Christianity is. So I could actually superscript this Buddhism Tibetan DL, okay? Because what I'm going to be talking about is the Dalai Lama's understanding and take on science isn't shared by even all members of the Gelug sect of which he is part, probably. I mean, but in any case, two of the things he discusses, which of course are of major interest to those of us who work in Western science, philosophy of science, are the status of the theory of evolution and the assumptions and the nature that we make about mind, the regulative assumptions that govern neuroscience, and so on and so forth. So I'll focus in particular on what he says in the book about those, and you'll see I respectfully disagree, and I'm puzzled by certain things he says, and you'll maybe see why, and we'll start a discussion that way. Okay, so this will be the thing. I'm not an expert on PowerPoint, so I was unable to draw the arrow correctly. Oh, here we go. But anyway, this is the idea. So this is the interplay. I'll be coming at things with a discussion on the one side, and this is my philosopher of biology, philosopher of mind hat. The neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, by which I just mean Darwinism plus population genetics, just take it to mean that. And naturalism about consciousness, by which for the first pass I mean something like having a certain attitude about the mind-body problem, and in particular the way it will be resolved, possibly, by cognitive and affective neuroscience, where we will come to understand consciousness as part of the natural world. Now, people will wonder, does that make me a materialist, a physicalist, a crass reductionist, or a bald reductionist, as John McDowell would say? I'll let you decide that. And as I say here, the Dalai Lama's interpretation of these issues. Okay. Now, the wonderful thing about this book is we get really neat things about Buddhist epistemology, which are along the way, and I'll talk about some of those. So I put up some quotes. People say these are too long, and I believe that, but I'll read this one. My confidence in venturing into science lies in my basic belief that as in science, so in Buddhism, understanding the nature of reality is pursued by means of critical investigation. Good, right? Then this. If scientific analysis were conclusively to demonstrate certain claims in Buddhism to be false, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon those claims. I have all the page numbers in the full text, but this is early in the book, as I recall. Now, this is a pretty remarkable claim. As I say as a Roman Catholic, my Pope doesn't say things like this. None of my popes, in fact. So I call this the welcome mat, and it is part of the dialectical interplay, the wonderful atmospherics that have been created by mind and life and mind and reality. I love being invited by these groups with such very specific titles. I once went to a conference in Crete where we were invited to go to Crete, and the topic was experience. And at the end of the conference, the guy who organized it said, I don't think anything was said here that would lead us to believe that we have a coherent volume. Let's go to the bar. I think it'll be different here. Mind and reality is much more down to earth. But so I put it this way. Here's the welcome mat. Come sit by my side, my Western scientific and philosopher friends. Tell me what you know. I will teach you what I know. We can debate. But in the end, it is our duty on both sides to change our previous views if we learn from the other that what we believe is unfounded or false. Now, the welcome mat, I've discovered this through helpful colleagues and a little research on my own. This isn't a new statement on his part. The first time His Holiness said something like this is back in '81, so 25 years ago. And he gives a really important example under my second bullet here. Buddhists believe in rebirth. But suppose, through various investigative means, science comes one day to a definitive conclusion that there is no rebirth. If this is definitely proven, watch the words here, then we must accept it, and we will accept it. Okay, this is very strong stuff. Again, I mean, just imagine the Pope talking about the Trinity that way. Okay. But then there's an important moment. And here I use Jimpa's, who's right in the front row here, statement of it, although it appears almost in very similar words in His Holiness's book. This, as I understand it, I'm accepting what the scholars say, many of them in the room here. I call it the caveat. It's called the caveat. So Jimpa says this, the Dalai Lama, however, offers an important caveat. He argues that it is critical to understand the scope and application of the scientific method, good, By invoking an important methodological principle, he reminds us not to conflate the two processes of not finding something and finding its non-existence. Now this goes back to Dharmakirti, the Indian epistemologist in the 17th century BCE. More importantly, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, to Tsongkhapa. Those very exact dates, I think, are due to Georges Dreyfus. How he got them, only God knows. Now, there's an important thing going on. The reason I put down Gendron Schöppel without the umlauts, because I don't know how to do that, is Gendron Schöppel is referred to by His Holiness throughout the book as a very important inspiration. He might have been the most important intellectual in Tibet in the 20th century. So in the 1930s, Schöppel went to the West. I think he got as far as Sri Lanka. And he was very impressed by Western science. And he came back and started to talk about the importance of Tibetan Buddhists opening their eyes and ears to Western science. There's a wonderful new book by Donald Lopez about Schöppel. But in any case, it's interesting that he cites Schöppel as inspiration, because Schöppel does question the caveat as an epistemological principle. That is, he worried that it allowed you to get away with hocus pocus. Now, why do I have a picture of Karl Popper here? Well, His Holiness talks a lot in the book about his relation with Popper and how impressed he was with Karl Popper, and in particular how he's impressed with Popper's criterion of falsifiability. Now, I'm not going to get into the intricacies of this, but the philosophers in the room will know, and I'll just say this much, that in the 1920s, 30s, into the 40s, in Berlin, Vienna, and in Popper's case, in New Zealand and England, in London, there were debates about trying to come up with a demarcation criterion between, sometimes it was said, science and non-science. So it might be what distinguishes physics and chemistry from literature and art. Okay? Those would both be cognitively significant, but obviously they have different methods. Other times it was trying to come up with a distinction between sense and nonsense. These are different agendas, but I'm not going to go into that. But this, as part of this debate, what Popper suggested, and this is why I call it, this is my way of casting Popper's agenda. The principle of falsifiability says this: a theory is scientific only if it sticks its neck out, and there are possible tests that could show it to be false if it is false. Okay? It's not, and Popper will sometimes put it, that the scientist has to have, as it were, epistemological passion to test his or her theories against the world, so that if they are false, it'll reveal itself as soon as possible. Now, there's often put in this idea of in principle falsifiability. Notice a statement like this: there's a certain temperature at a certain longitude and latitude of the farthest planet from us in the Milky Way galaxy. That is in principle testable. In fact, we all believe that there is a temperature at that place. And so I say it's 22 degrees centigrade. Well, and suppose I even have some scientific theory that indicates that that's a kind of a place of that climate. You might say, well, why bother? We're tens of thousands of years away from really testing that. But that would be in principle testable. Okay, so this is, so the question I raised, this epistemological question, first question is, despite His Holiness's welcome mat and the willingness to change Buddhist doctrine in light of whatever science shows to be, proves to be true, and then Buddhism will change, you might worry that the caveat is objectionably protectionistic. Now I believe, and pardon me, Jimpa, if I'm wrong about this example, I think Jimpa gives the example of, suppose someone says there are ghosts in my hotel room, and I look around for the poltergeist and I don't find them. The caveat says actually that my failure to discover the ghost in the room doesn't show that there are no ghosts in the room. Now, immediately one would ask, well, what evidence is there, though, that there are ghosts in the room? And you might say, well, I've used all the methods I know of to test for ghosts in the room. Tell me some new ones. And if you get to a point where you can't tell me some new ones that I haven't thought of, you'll be accused on Popperian grounds, just to use him, of making a statement for which neither you or I can come up with any conceivable empirical tests, and then there's a problem. Okay? I hope you just understand the general point here. I am going fast, but I'm trying to be as clear as possible too. So watch out for these two claims as I go on. I'm going to now quick turn to discussion of evolution after I say one thing about cosmology. Watch these two claims. Mental properties are sui generis, that is, they're of their own type. They're distinctive in ontological or metaphysical kind, immaterial properties. This seems to be a widespread belief among Buddhists I know. And we'd have to cash out what we mean by immaterial, but the idea is that of course, in the West, we're familiar with this as there's some form of mind-body dualism going on. Usually. I don't think Buddhism has to be committed to this at all, but I pointed out to you, so watch for that. The second claim is this doctrine of rebirth, which, as I understand it, and as I read things, this idea of a sort of karmic eschatology, being rewarded and punished in afterlives, arose in India well before the rise of Buddhism in the 5th century BCE. The doctrine of reincarnation. There's some very good literature. There's a wonderful book by a Princeton professor of anthropology, whose name I'm just forgetting, but I have the source, on what he calls karmic and non-karmic eschatologies. A non-karmic one, these are common in small groups, and they're not moralized, so that children are born, and then they say, "There's grandma again." That's in small communities. Now, this is an interesting point, because you might say, they're seeing grandma because of Darwinian processes that construct family resemblances. But what happens in India and other places is you do start to get karmic eschatologies at least 500 years before Buddhism, in which as people start to move between social groups, their coming back or recycling into the world is governed by a system of rewarding and punishing them for the quality of their lives, as it were, even if the community itself doesn't expect them to cycle back through the community, right? But so these ideas spread like wildfire, and it's one of those cases where at least my own suspicions are that it's an unstable belief within Buddhism that was picked up from other traditions. Okay, the one thing I'll say about cosmology, because I think it's cool, is Brian Greene isn't here, is he? But Michael Silberstein is here. That's good. When the Dalai Lama talks about his conversations with quantum physicists and astrophysicists, and he learns about the Big Bang Theory, he says this: "Fine, but not, of course, the first Big Bang." Now, I think this is very, very interesting, because many Westerners know, Philosophy 101 students are always puzzled when you tell them about the Big Bang Theory. 14 whatever billion years ago, there was a singularity that banged, and here we are. You say, "Oh, thank you very much. Now I can go home in peace." That's the answer to why there's something rather than nothing. Good. I was wondering about that. Well, now, of course, physicists are divided, in my experience, and philosophers of physics, whether you're allowed to ask the question, well, how did the singularity get there? Or what was there before the singularity? Some physicists will tell you, and this is true in terms of internal to physics, that we can't talk about what was before the singularity banged, because time only began when it banged. So the concept of before is not a good question to ask in that context. Other physicists will say, it's not a bad question, I sort of know what you're up to, and we don't know. Then there's Planck's constant. You can only get back to whatever it is, 10 to the minus 43 seconds after the Big Bang, and whatever. Okay. But there's lots of interesting work now where people think there wasn't a Big Bang. What there was a big seep. A wormhole opened from a parallel universe, and so what we call the Big Bang came in from that universe, and its universe is all the way back. This goes very, very nicely with a kind of acceptance of naturalistic regresses of a materialistic sort. And interestingly enough, I think it goes nicely with Buddhist ideas about dependent origination all the way down, back, up, and down. So I just point that out to you as, of course, this is what, we have to understand the Dalai Lama is not a scientist. He's just immensely curious, and he's a quick study. Okay, now on to evolution. What I'm now about to say I think is very important. It's about Buddhist epistemology and scientific epistemology, and what His Holiness says here is this. He says, Buddhism accords greatest authority to experience, with reason second and scripture last. Experience, reason, scripture. Now, it's very important here because Buddhism is not, because it's not an Abrahamic religion, doesn't treat its scriptures, at least in certain Buddhist traditions, as, well, in any of them, as the word of God, because there is no God, at least in the sense of Abrahamic traditions, of someone who starts the cosmic ball rolling, creator of the universe. It's a non-theistic religion, if it is a religion at all, right? So, His Holiness does say something which I think is false. He says that the difference between Buddhism and science is that science has no scriptures. The reason I think that's false is just because of work like Kuhn's, where we would say that at any point in science, there is a canonical theory, and you'll see this operating in my own assumptions at the end. I want to be honest about that. There's a canonical theory, which is the place you go when you're puzzled about the phenomenon. And these are the sort of theory as they've emerged from wise people in the field. So that's just, so, but again, in the Buddhist tradition, in the Theravedic tradition, it would be the Pali Canon. In other traditions, it would be that plus any commentaries, and they'd fill a low library. But the wisdom of the ages by mortal human beings, some enlightened, some less enlightened, some semi-enlightened, just like everything else. Okay. Okay, now here he's worrying about a doctrine he calls scientific materialism. In the book and in scientific materialism is used, I think, in a problematic way. I notice I don't quote it here, but he says this about the scientific picture of things. The problem is not with the empirical data of science, but with the contention that these data alone constitute the legitimate ground for developing a comprehensive worldview or an adequate means for responding to the world's problems. Now here I completely disagree. I mean, I completely agree, and I disagree, though, that there really are people out there who think that science can answer all the questions. There are questions about how we ought to live, both individually and collectively. Science, at least as traditionally practiced, is not the domain in which norms are assessed. Science can tell us how the world is, it can explain certain things, it can predict certain things, but there's other work for other fields to do. So I think that's true, and if people think that science has all the answers, I think that's right. But what I want to distinguish here, and I want to position myself on the side of the good guys, is what I call tame versus imperialistic scientific naturalism. I avoid the word, and I've been doing this for 25 or 30 years, I avoid the word materialism or physicalism, and that's partly out of deference to the fact that physicists don't know what the nature of matter ultimately is yet. Maybe they won't ever. But I think of naturalism as as a way of saying that you have a certain commitment to the processes that operate in the world being natural. Now, Barry Stroud, in a presidential address to the American Philosophical Association a few years ago, said that both by the OED and by his reading of philosophical literature, commitment to naturalism just comes down to this. Just say no to supernatural causes and entities if they're introduced to explain things, where supernatural is kind of left open, but we get a feel for what it is, okay? So what I call tame scientific naturalism says that when it comes to trying to understand what there is in the natural world and how it works, use only the best scientific epistemology and ontology to regulate your inquiry. And I'm using ontology equivalently to metaphysics. There is a view, I don't think, again, I think it's a boogeyman. I don't think most people, there are people who I know at least who hold this view, but it comes up a lot in the certain unpleasant moments in debates, what I call scientific naturalism materialistic. That should be ism. It receives ontological expression this way. A, what there is and all there is in any possible world is what science says there is. And it receives epistemological expression this way. Everything worth expressing can be expressed in a scientific idiom. Again, I don't know anybody who holds this view, but I think it is the boogeyman that's out there sometimes when people use words like materialism, reductionism, and so on. Especially this last one, scientism. There was a review of Dan Dennett's book in the New York Times last week, where the reviewer accuses him of scientism, where what he calls scientism is the view that science can explain, in what I call the tame version, or shed light on, because there are limits to what we can explain just because we may not be smart enough, the natural world and how it works. In this case, religion, why it's there, what its motivations are, and so on and so forth. He calls that view scientism, but I think that scientism really should be reserved for the stronger doctrine. And it's implausible, but Dennett, and I don't hold it, for example, it would be the view that somehow or other, and this would be insane, what Bach, Mozart, Coltrane, Picasso, the Rolling Stones expressed could be expressed in mathematical ways. Shakespeare. In scientific ways. It's just an implausible doctrine. No one holds it. Okay, so now I move to, with this as background, sort of epistemological background, to what His Holiness says about evolution. Now, here you're just going to see that some of the things he says were part of what Wittgenstein would call sometimes playing a different language game. I actually don't even understand what he's talking about at certain points. But I should say this before I start, that my dear friend Alan Wallace, here in the front row, he did write a very nice response to George Johnson's review of this book in the New York Times, because Johnson had raised the issue of whether His Holiness was a friend of intelligent design. Sad to say, all the intelligent design websites say he is. Alan pointed out that he isn't, but so much for our influence. And he's not. But there's some funny stuff going on. Here we go. My own view is that the entire process of the unfolding of a universe system is a matter of the natural law of causality. Cool. But then His Holiness makes clear there is another kind of causality, karmic causality. And this is very familiar to most people, but karma means action and refers to the intentional acts of sentient beings. Such acts may be physical, verbal, or mental, even just thoughts or feelings, all of which have impacts upon the psyche of an individual, no matter how minute. Again, I think this is completely acceptable to the sort of tame naturalism that I want to accept. I think it's things that psychologists teach us all the time. If I allow myself to be angry towards someone, let the anger fester privately, it poisons my soul, it makes me less pleasant, and so on and so forth. And so this is, and furthermore, of course, the things we do in the world have effects. So far, so good. But then he says this, and I apologize for so much text on the here, but this is a quote that puzzles me. He says, karma comes into the picture at 2 points. So remember 2 slides ago, it says, from the Buddhist point of view, the world is the outgrowth of natural causality. Okay, that's what a Darwinian is going to say. Terrific, we're on the same side. Karma comes into the picture at 2 points. And now I put in the numbers here because I'm not sure where the 2 points occur. I can tell where the first point occurs. When the universe has evolved to a stage where it can support the life of sentient beings, its fate becomes entangled with the karma of the beings who will inhabit it. The future tense there plays an important role in the next slide. Something funny is going on, I think. In Buddhism, this karmic causality is seen as a fundamental natural process and not as any kind of divine mechanism or working out of a preordained design. This is why Alan correctly points out that there's nothing in Buddhism that supports the particular form of intelligent design theory operating in the West or at stake in Dover, Pennsylvania. I think this is where the second thing comes in, where I have the number 2 here. By the way, in all the slides, italics and boldings are mine, and numbers. Apart from the karma of individual sentient beings, whether it is collective or personal, it is entirely erroneous to think of karma as some transcendental unitary entity that acts like a god in a theistic system of a determinist law by which a person's life is fated. Again, fine, good. From the scientific view, the theory of karma may be a metaphysical assumption, but it is no more so than the assumption that all of life is material and originated out of poor chance. Now, there's a lot going on here. And in the book, His Holiness does say that he objected to Ursula Goodenough, who's a wonderful molecular biologist at University of Washington, St. Louis, when Ursula said, Darwinian selection operates by random processes of mutation, and then Mother Nature is very fussy. The randomness bothered him. I just point that out to you. And so let's try to figure out what's going on. I'm not going to get to the bottom of this here, but I bring it out for discussion. So let me say that there's a tame use of the concept of karmic causation, utterly tame, that I think anybody in the West could accept. And it goes like this. Once sentient beings exist, that is, once they exist, they didn't always exist, there's a certain point in time. And what I mean by sentient beings is, in the first instance, when creatures, whatever they were, that could feel pleasure and pain and maybe had photoreceptor cells to see things, okay? I'm talking about minimal sentience at this point. There's something it is like, though, to be, to use Tom Nagel's famous phrase, such a creature, okay? Now, for us, it's quite exotic what it's like to be us. But, so once sentient beings are on the scene, they have effects, and these effects are of 2 kinds, personal and interpersonal, and they're environmental. We leave our garbage out, and that affects the natural and built world, and then you could add all kinds of other effects, social, economic, political, and so on. And then I just point out, under number 2, karmic causation as depicted in the first thing is natural. It is not due to theistic intervention at the beginning of the process, say in creating a big bang with a plan, nor is there intentional, intelligent design along the way, other than the effects of the sentient beings, human and non-human, who are creating effects via their actions. This is all perfectly tame. So you might ask the question, though, why even introduce, once you introduce natural causation, why introduce this kind of causation at all? And I actually do think it plays a role. But just notice this. What I call tame karmic causation involves 3 assumptions. Each one is uncontroversial. Sentient beings exist. Some of these beings engage in intentional action. All of us do. But I'm just saying down real low, maybe they don't, in some sense of intentional, behave intentionally. And all the actions of the sentient beings have abundant effects. Right? Simple. Now the question would be, why distinguish it from natural causation? But I think there's an answer, a principled answer here. It's just that natural causation is a superordinate term that we could divide into the kinds of causation that involve, say, basic laws of physics, force equals mass times acceleration, things like that, and then the kind of causation that involves the actions of beings with minds. So you might say, Naturwissenschaften, the natural sciences, are concerned with ordinary causation, in the broadest possible sense, physical interactions, and Geisteswissenschaften, with the Geist being a small g, not spirit sciences, but human sciences, are concerned with the effects of intentional beings on the interpersonal, personal, and built worlds. Okay, so I think there's you might just say psychology, neuroscience, etc., are interested in this kind of stuff, and we need to mark it out because it has unique features. Okay. Now, but he then says this. More difficult, perhaps, is the first intervention of karma, which is effectively the maturation of the karmic potential of the sentient beings who will occupy the universe, which sets in motion its coming into being. So this is what I call karmic causation untamed. I don't understand it. I mean, I just am honest. I mean, you know, and His Holiness is a great guy, but he's hard to like get time to talk to one-on-one to say, could you tell me what this means? So this would be untamed, and I think it's out there. I'm not even saying it's in that quote. I sort of acknowledge I don't understand the quote completely. But this would be an untamed view, I think, that at least my philosopher of biology friends, plus me in that role, would have trouble with. At one point, the universe harbored incipient or unactualized sentience. Actually, that part I'm willing to give, because sentience did emerge at some point or other, just like life emerged from the world in which there was no life. It evolved, okay, when sentience emerged, though, this would be the problem. It was not due to Darwinian processes. It involved instead, quote, the maturation of the karmic potential of the sentient beings who will occupy the universe. The maturation of this potential sentience, quote, sets in motion that universe, my brackets, the one with sentience in it coming into being. Again, someone can tell me what this says. I have an idea, but I'm just not, in my full paper I explore it more fully, but I'm just not going to say here. Now, I just have a comment. The story looks Platonic. If you've read the Timaeus, you know the demiurge overflows with love and goodness, and stuff comes out of it. It also looks suspiciously teleological from so it does look like there's actually pre-sentient sentience coming there, as it were, not just in the way that eventually by natural laws sentience will appear, because photoreceptor cells just, have been invented 75 million different times maybe, or 75,000 I think is what evolutionary biologists say, on different chains. And they're really good design solutions to receiving information about the world, and in not all cases, but many cases, there's sentience attached to them. And that just happens, and once it happens, it's such a great design solution, it's selected for it. That's the way the Darwinian will go. But it does look, at the same time, as I say, to involve something beyond karmic causation tame, and I don't think there is any evidence for it. Now, think back to the caveat. I'm just saying there's no evidence for it, empirical evidence for it. There's no argument that I can give that it's not possible that I've disproven it, but I think the standard view in Western science is you look at what the scientific evidence makes plausible. Most of our generalizations are inductive, not demonstrative. So how does this kind of idea fit with the way science operates? And it's problematic, it seems to me. Okay. His Holiness, I want to speed up, I guess. I'm doing okay, though. He does ask this question, though. I like the honesty here. He says, so what is the mechanism? And now I'm assuming he's talking about untamed karmic causation, connects to the evolution of the physical system, and he admits that the Abhidharma, which I know best for the two famous chapters on Buddhist psychology, but it also contains cosmology, views about time and space, and so on. It was probably composed, am I right, about 100, it's part of the Pali Canon. Oh, it was written down 500 AD? Yeah, so the Buddha lives in 500. You don't start to get things written down until about the 1st or 2nd century, and then this one is about 500. My experts in the front row they're nodding in different ways. So I guess the answer is, but it's a while ago, okay? He says these texts, these cosmological texts, don't have a lot to say about this, and then he says this, the ability to discern exactly where karma intersects with the natural law of causation is traditionally said to lie only within the Buddha's omniscient mind. Now, this again is just I'm not picking on His Holiness. I mean, I love the man. This is a epistemic move again, which we Westerners would have trouble with. Actually, he should have trouble with it too. Although Tibetans are funny about this. The reason he should have trouble with it is because remember what I said about Buddhist epistemology, experience, reason, and scriptures, but the scriptures are written by humans at various levels of enlightenment, and because a Buddha is not a god, he's just very enlightened, the idea of omniscience is peculiar to ascribe here. With that said, three theses that will cause serious explanatory obstacles, I think, with reconciling completely, I mean, Buddhist views on evolution and karmic causation with the standard neo-Darwinian view are these. First, the view that karmic causation of the untamed sort exists or obtains in the universe, that it's actually an operative causal feature. The tame one is fine. And that it's not a variety of ordinary causation and is understandable only by an omniscient mind. I mean, notice again, one could just say, ever saying that an idea that you're going to hold on to as part of your philosophical theory is not understandable by you who is putting forward the theory, but is understandable from the point of view of an omniscient being is an epistemologically protectionist move that I think would be a problem. The second thesis that will cause serious explanatory obstacles is this. The emergence of sentience is the necessary metaphysical outgrowth of, quote, the maturation of the karmic potential of the sentient beings who will occupy the universe. Again, the future tense there, so there's, again, this is the quote that I had trouble interpreting, and there are many people much, much smarter at interpreting these texts than I am in the audience, experts on this, who maybe will explain to us how this makes sense. Okay, and then finally, if His Holiness were to want to say sentient beings are not animals, now this ties in with, I haven't gotten to this yet, but it'll take us to the next topic, consciousness. The Darwinian theory is very, very firmly committed to the view that Homo sapiens are mammals, and that our parts are all mammalian parts. There's no spiritual substances in us, there's no soul. Now you might say that's groovy from the point of Buddhism because they don't have a soul, permanent, immutable soul either, but this is where we're now about to move to the debate about consciousness. So I just point out to you the ability to have this dialogue is in place. We're having it. Do we agree about everything? No, and one way to put it is just that there are some unanswered questions of interpretation before we even know where the disagreements exactly are. So this brings us on to, and this is the last part of my talk, the second topic, naturalism about consciousness. Now here I have firmer understanding of what His Holiness is saying and firmer views. He says this: the problem is how to reconcile two strands of explanation. First, that any universe and the beings within it arise from karma, and second, that there is a natural process of cause and effect which simply unfolds. And here we get the move to mind. The early Buddhist texts suggest that matter on the one hand and consciousness on the other relate according to their own process of cause and effect, which gives rise to a new set of functions and properties in both cases. On the basis of understanding their nature, causal relations, and functions, one can then derive inferences for both matter and consciousness that give rise to knowledge. Again, I think this is interpretable as a welcoming gesture. We don't yet know what ontology is going to back up the discourse about matter and consciousness, but we're in the domain of, when I say, I, Owen, have now decided to walk to my right, someone says, where did you decide that? The way I speak, even though I'm a naturalist, is in my mind, right? And my mind moves my body. So, then you push me and I explain more to you how I think that's going on. So the concepts of matter and consciousness are just long-standing, and we have to see how they're cashed out. So there'll be a panel on this, but I just want to say this. So there's phenomenology, and in Cisco Varela and now in Evan Thompson, who collaborated with Cisco, a great late person, very important to all of us who've been involved in this dialogue. Cisco invented, or was the first to use the word neurophenomenology. It's actually very close to a method that I described with a much less sexy title called the natural method, where if you want to understand the mind, you have to get phenomenological reports. You can get them even from rhesus macaques. There's lots of great literature about this. You teach them, like when there's binocular rivalry experiments, for example, that I talk about in my book on Consciousness Reconsidered, 1992 or something like that. So you teach rhesus macaques to press a button to tell you whether they're seeing horizontal or vertical lines when you do this. Turns out there's a visual lock on horizontal and vertical in this kind of experiment, and you only see one. It's like a Gestalt type of illusion, where you lock onto one or the other. So the rhesus macaques, you got their part of their brain that detects lines hooked up. In this case, I think it was EEG. Logostestes and Schall did this experiment. I love it still, in the 80s. And the monkey gives its phenomenological report. Now seeing vertical, now seeing horizontal. And you look actually at what neurons or populations of neurons are activated and subserve the perception of the different lines. And they're somewhat different populations. Now, obviously, neurophenomenology is easiest to do with simple perceptual events. So Cisco and his colleagues in France at the time were doing things on Necker cube illusions. Again, you know in advance what part of the brain is decoding Necker cubes. You watch and you have people, now humans can say forward, backward, and you look and see what's happening. And as I recall, these smart French scientists were able to write simple differential equations which mapped what the neurons were doing. Okay, so, nonetheless, and this is, I think, something that Alan especially has lots to say about in many of his books, it is true that the Buddhist phenomenological tradition is much, much richer than Western phenomenology. Its taxonomy of mental states. You know, you give a Buddhist, there's always the number they give, 84,000. You say, how many types of anger are there? They say 84,000. They can do it. The point is, in the Abhidhamma, in the 2 chapters, I think it's 1 and 7 or 1 and 6 or 1 and 9, I forget, devoted to the classification of mental state types, is just extraordinary what gets done. But one still might want to know, and we will want to know, what is the epistemic status of phenomenological reports? In well-controlled situations, like I was just talking about, seeing vertical or horizontal lines, we have a little bit of a sense of what's going on. It's fairly simple. When someone starts to describe what's going on, excuse me, for more complex mental states, or make inferences about the nature of mental states. By that I have in mind making inferences that can be of different kinds, and one sees these in Buddhist texts. Sometimes there might be claims that go from epistemic to ontological. So my mental states seem immaterial, therefore they are immaterial. We've seen this in the West. You might see it in the East. There are thinkers in the West, by the way, good phenomenologists, who did not experience their mental states as immaterial. William James and Merleau-Ponty. And interestingly enough, both of them, when they say, well, if you think that snow is white, what does that feel like? You know, you don't get the neural texture of it or something. They say it has something to do with breathing. I don't know what it is, which is interesting. Both of them refer to breathing and consciousness. Okay, that's just telling you. So we want to ask, what does first-person introspection or phenomenology reveal about what mind and its states are like? And so that's one thing. I mean, this is just the old question of, is the mind as it seems? And you might just say, well, automatically it is as seemings are as they seem. Okay, so that's like not controversial, but there actually have been people, like Sigmund Freud comes to mind, who would worry about whether even the seemings are accurately depicted or reported. There are worries from Wittgenstein and Ryle about whether we have adequate languages to describe our mental states and so on and so forth. So anyway, And then there's a second question. So the first question is the seemings themselves. Do we get them right just in virtue of them being up close and personal and having direct access to them? And secondly, there's questions about what those states really are. And here, what they really are, I mean something like answers to such questions as, even if it is the case for all of us in the audience that when we think snow is white, nothing is revealed about neural texture, what's going on in our brain, is that remotely decisive about any conclusions about whether they have neural texture or not? And my answer, and most of those us naturalist philosophers say, absolutely not. In fact, here we would tie in Darwinian theory with naturalism about consciousness and say, Mother Nature. Someone's going to ask me a question about why I, personify her. It's just, it's okay. Once you accept Darwin, you can do that. It's a good way to talk. But I can change it if you want to. It's a brilliant design solution not to have us in touch with the neural texture of our experience. Just think about it for a second. Whatever you've got, 10 to the 14 neurons with 10 to the 11th synaptic connections, a lot of them computing snow is white. You don't want to know that, okay? Be very noisy. Okay, does phenomenology therefore reveal anything more, anything other than how the mind seems first personally? Well, one answer is, yes, it would if you link it up with neurophenomenological studies of the sort that Evan will be talking about and other people in this room do. Namely, you get first personal reports, and like Logotheses and Schall, study what brains are doing at the same time, and then you get this epistemic linkage. So His Holiness says in the book, it's really terrific if we get dialogues going between first personal and third personal descriptions of mind, behavior, and brain, and it could open up a whole new way of investigating consciousness. He's under the impression that this isn't being done, or at least I get that sense in the book, and my response is, no, this is the only way the show can go on, and it has been going on. Although, again, I think that Western phenomenological techniques are not as advanced. Okay, so I just come now to the conclusion, and I'm really going to be throwing out some questions for you. This is Christoph Koch, and I just used his book. The title is... Ned, you know the title? No, that's Francis Crick. The Quest for Consciousness. So, yes, Teed Rockwell gave me the title of Francis Crick's book, and Christoph and Francis worked until Francis's death together, but Christoph is primarily a vision scientist, and he, with Francis Crick, have been working, and it's a book because it's a great book, I think, for philosophers and neuroscientists to read together, and I do this with my students, because there's a great deal of sensitivity to how difficult the quest is to develop a robust and credible theory of the conscious mind that's fully naturalistic. Now, what is the problem? Well, notice here, and I call this a regulative assumption using Kantian language. The regulative assumption of neuroscience is this. I mean, pretty much across the board. There aren't too many outliers on this hypothesis. Consciousness emerges from neuronal features of the brain. Now, a lot depends here on how we understand emergence. There are emergent properties in the universe. I'm still told that, from a chemical point of view, nothing about the nature of hydrogen and oxygen would lead you to know that collecting it would make wet stuff. But we know that water is H2O, right? We know that gold is the substance with atomic number 79. So we have examples in the sciences where we have established strict identities between one way of speaking and another way of speaking, between two language games in Wittgensteinian sense. One interesting question is it going to work out that way in neuroscience? I mean, there are various possibilities here. One would be some kind of ontological independence of mental phenomenon, of qualitative experiential mental states. There's a problem with going down that road, and I'll close with mention of that. But in any case, this is the sort of a standard view, and Christoph's book is, this is his, how the regulative assumption cashes out the ontological issue. There must be an explicit correspondence between any mental event and its neural correlates. Now, this doesn't mean, just so you're clear, or we're all clear, that something like what philosophers used to call type identity theory, that for everybody in this room, if you think the thought that snow is white, the very same neural event will be occurring in each and every one of us. Almost no one believes that anymore. I mean, I don't know anyone who believes it anymore. Some people do believe, and I'm just personally, because I'm not involved in this research, open on this, but it might be, since we know human visual cortex, for example, has, say, on the order of 25 different areas. So if I throw a yellow tennis ball out to the audience and someone catches it, in fact, your brain computed color and shape in different areas. It's called the binding problem in neuroscience. You're not aware of that phenomenologically, but that's the way it happens. Okay? Now that's interesting, because John Locke actually thought this. And if you read John Locke, you think, boy, Locke is really confused when he talks about simple ideas, because Locke says, and you think he wasn't paying attention to his own mind. That's probably true in his case. But one thing he had right was that these are somehow computed, as it were, represented separately in different areas and bound together. Okay? Now, what does explicit correspondence mean? One way that we philosophers go on this is to talk about a spooky concept, which is supervenience, that mental events are emergent properties and have a relation of being carried along on top of or emerging from a neural substrate. And there's lots of controversy about how to cash out concepts of supervenience. And there are sort of local views and global views. So a global view might just be this. If you ask, what in Owen's brain corresponds or is the mental event of Owen phenomenologically experiencing a few hundred people in Low Library at Columbia on this date, you might want to say, there it is, that little thing. Or you might want to say, you go global and say, no, it's stuff occurring all over him. Maybe it's fully embodied, some people will say, and some people will even take it into the world. I'm not going to resolve that issue. Whichever way you go on this, you're staying in the world. Sometimes you're staying in the body. I heard John Searle at a recent American Philosophical Association debate that I chaired say, okay, John Searle digests food, the whole person, but, and you might even say the food he is digesting began in the world, but if you want to know where he's digesting the food, don't look in his toe, his knee, or his brain. Look in his tummy. And most of us will say the same thing for mental events. Here is the primary locus of activity. Okay, I have a whole view worked out on this. It's close to John Searle's biological realism. I call it subjective realism. It's just that there are some parts of the universe which are essentially Janus-faced, and it's in virtue of, so that my mental events, on my view, are uniquely realized in Owen. Susan Carey's mental events are uniquely realized in Susan Carey, and that's because each of us is attached uniquely to our own nervous system. It's not like a real big mystery. We have our own experiences because we are attached to our own nervous systems, but they are in us, in broadly construed. Okay. Now, His Holiness, and I'll get to the end almost, I think I'm 2 slides from the end, he does say this. Not in the book, actually, so here I'm cheating a little bit on my own agenda. I believe this was in a paper, in fact, I know it was. My Warhol minutes, my 15 minutes of fame, occurred in 2003 when I published a paper in the New Scientist magazine. They devoted a special issue to human nature. And my paper was called The Color of Happiness, which was about the very first research that was done on Matthieu Ricard's brain. And I reported the results about the activity in left frontal cortex as tantalizing. And Reuters and the Associated Press, I knew that when I got to my office, reported that Buddhists lead scientists to happiness center in brain. I, in fact, was the scientist who discovered this. If you pay me, I tell you where it is. Anyway, I kept correcting the mistakes, but even when I was on the British broadcasting system, Canadian broadcasting system, Australian broadcasting system, I said, look, the study has an N of 1, and he's like, whatever. They said, yeah, but what makes all Buddhists so happy? And how did you find this? Well, anyway, I said I was over the telephone with Richie Davidson in Wisconsin and whatever. But His Holiness wrote an article next to mine because he's been very encouraging about work on neural correlates. But I think he is resistant to what naturalists like myself are going to want to say, that the brain is, that phenomenology, subjective experience, is realized in the brain in a way to be worked out. So he says this in that paper: there is no reason to believe that the innate mind, the very luminous, essential luminous nature of awareness, has neural correlates, because it is not physical, not contingent upon the brain. So while I agree that with neuroscience that gross mental events correlate with brain activity, I also feel that on a more subtle level of consciousness, brain and mind are two separate entities. He's not a substantive dualist, so the entity talk here is unfortunate. But now what's going on here? I think it's internal to Buddhist texts, scriptures, as he says. Do I have a blank slide here? Good. This is my interpretation. Remember, Buddhism, a lot of Buddhist traditions have this idea of realizing Buddha nature in oneself. But Buddhism posits three poisons, which are kind of like the part of part of all human nature, or animal nature: avarice, anger, resentment, thirst, and delusion, false view. Now those infiltrate the bodies and brains of us. If we are to achieve enlightenment, I think there's a presupposition that there should be a part of us that's not defiled by any of that stuff. I'm just saying this is a move that I'm reconstructing now is what's going on. So if you meditate a lot for several decades, you got to realize that pure potential we already have. I put this in deductive form. This pure potential consists in realizing the part of the mind that is defiled in no way by the three poisons of acquisitiveness, anger, and delusion. This part cannot in principle ever have had commerce with anything material, that is the brain, for example, because then it would be defiled. I'm guessing here, but Buddha nature is possible unless we possess necessarily a part of mind that is pure and that cannot in principle be defiled. Pure luminous consciousness is that part. Now, and this is the part that he asserts in the previous quote, that we should not expect to find any neural correlates for, because it's not part of the natural fabric of the universe. Okay? Now this again, just so you can see, a naturalist is not going to go for this. Now, the fact is, going back to the caveat for a moment, you're going to find neural correlates if you're studying a live human being. So what he's going to have to say about a meditator in a state where he's reaching or achieving pure luminous consciousness is that the correlates you're getting are of other activity, but not of the pure luminous consciousness itself. But that's a methodological problem I'll let him solve. Okay, but I think this is what's going on here. So this is at least one clear place where I think you see immaterialism about consciousness, and it's one of the things I told you to watch out for. Okay, I've already said this, and I want to stop. So I've already said that this is the program. There's lots of really wonderful work by people in this room, not by me at all, about what the methods will be to move eventually from saying, okay, we keep coming up with these correlates. When does a correlate, as it were, map enough onto the mental event that we're talking about that we can say they're one and the same thing? Okay? Again, I'm not talking about type identity theory. That seems too simple. And as Alan has pointed out, there's some new mathematical models that we may need, dynamic systems theory, theories that allow for downward causation, and so on. So I close now, if my machine will go. Oh, this was an unfortunate conversation, but I'll go into this later. If I can find out who this guy was, I'll kill him. His Holiness said, I vividly remember a discussion I had with some eminent neuroscientists at an American medical school. And he asked this one guy, he said, well, you keep telling me about how the amygdala produces like anger and stuff. What about like downward causation where the mind controls the amygdala? Well, this is well known to take place, but the scientist said, no, that's impossible. Now, what he might have been saying, I don't know, this is a long quote in the book, is that if the Dalai Lama means immaterial mental events controlling physical events, we've got causal problems. If he just means, do higher brain regions control lower brain regions? The answer is obviously yes. And he rightly says, this left me very puzzled. Interestingly enough, he said, I didn't tell the guy that, though. Okay, now I close with the last two slides. In the current state of play in consciousness studies, neurophenomenology, naturalism about consciousness, His Holiness suggests neutrality about the mind-brain relation. He says, it may well be that the question of whether consciousness can ultimately be reduced to physical processes or whether our subjective experiences are non-material features of the world will remain a matter of philosophical choice. Maybe you could say, and this would be like people I call Mysterians, it'll remain a matter of philosophical contention in perpetuity. The key issue here, though, and this is now his advice, is to bracket out the metaphysical question about mind and matter and to explore together how to understand scientifically the various modalities of the mind. I believe it is possible for Buddhism and modern science to engage in collaboration in the understanding of consciousness while leaving aside the philosophical question of whether consciousness is ultimately physical. You could do that, but there's a price. And let me just close with what I think is the price. But the price I'm going to talk about comes from my own understanding of the state of play in the sciences. Okay? So maybe I'm wrong about this. All right. In conclusion, first I'll return to the evolution. I indicated this already. Beware of this idea of karmic causation untamed. Why should you beware of it? There's no evidence in favor of it, at least the way it's quoted in what I quoted, unless I misunderstand it completely. And there's lots of evidence against there being such things, such as the universe holding, in some sense, in its bosom, certain things before they happen. Life did emerge from insensate stuff, and there is work in complex emergent systems that maybe could allow this kind of talk, but I'm just saying that the current state of play makes at least that untamed version of karmic causation, I think, worrisome. With respect to consciousness, I do think we need to beware of any kinds of dualism. Buddhists in general like to talk down dualisms, but this is one that they seem, the immaterialism about mind, or the mind being sui generis, its own special kind, seems to be out there. And the reason I don't think we should be neutral on it has to do with what I call here the epiphenomenalist worry, or what I've called the epiphenomenalist suspicion. Epiphenomenalism, in William James's wonderful book, The Psychology, Principles of Psychology in 1890, he called it an unwarrantable impertinence. There he described one version of epiphenomenalism. He compared it to the sizzling of the eggs in the frying pan, or even better, he compared it to the steam engine, the train running on coal, and the coal is what's making the engine go, okay? And then when you come to an intersection, the engineer pulls the toot, 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 okay? That is a side effect of the heat building up in the system. It has no interesting causal relation whatsoever to how the train is going forward. It's just permitted, as it were, and it's useful as a side effect of the system. Now, why worry about epiphenomenalism? Well, no one understands how immaterial things could cause physical things to happen. So this is one reason those of us who are naturalists about consciousness like the idea that mental events are brain events, in some sense to be spelled out. And insofar as they are, they're part of the natural fabric of experience, and you don't have what are, from current perspectives, insurmountable problems with mental causation. You really can't explain how Owen woke up to the alarm this morning, got here to give this talk, moved this 180 pounds of flesh all the way over here. Well, the taxi did that. There's not a problem. If you do have to explain how Owen's decision worked into his brain and produced these effects, you've got a lot of problems, because that's a lot of weight to move. Thank you.